So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you my group's presentation of a demonstration to our obsession to the forestry profession.
Thank you, Trevor, for that interesting introduction. On behalf of myself, Anika Hodgson, Adam Archibald, and Nick Tanton, we'd like to present to you Future Forest Planners Managing the Woodlots of Grand Lake. Starting off with an overview of the presentation this afternoon, we'll start with the project introduction, giving the location and previous history of both properties. We'll move into our goals and objectives that have really shaped this entire management plan. We'll go over methods of our inventory and our operations planning. We'll go into results of the current forest condition, our 5- and 25-year plans, our sensitivity analysis, encompassing pertinent issues to forest management today, and we'll jump back to our goals and objectives, which will assess our status of these after our operations plans, and then we'll move into question period. Oops, sorry. Jorgen Gloria Baylor and Five Islands Forest Development own 2 adjacent woodlots of 1,126 hectares in size. The overarching vision of both of these properties is to produce high-quality timber for revenue over a long-term sustainable basis. Both properties are located within the Grand Lake area of New Brunswick. Outlined in gray is the Five Islands property, and in the center, Jorg Baylor's property adjacent to Grand Lake. Other uses in the land neighboring these properties is heavily weighted towards recreational and seasonal cottage usage. Jorg Baylor's property was purchased in 1982 following Five Islands in 2001. Both properties were managed prior to purchase, and they are harvested intermittently since the 80s. In the map provided by the Southern New Brunswick Wood Cooperative are previous treatments of pre-commercial thinning scattered across both properties and a section of planting in the Five Islands portion. A combined net income of both properties is between 2001 and 2015 is $125,500. Our management plan components involve our inventory, our finalized stand delineations, our 5- and 25-year operations plans, our financial assessment of these plans, and various sensitivity analysis, as I said prior. We have 3 goals that really encompass our management considerations for this management plan, which include sustainably harvesting, increasing and improving the value and the productivity across each property, keeping in mind the environmental sensitive areas, and consider neighboring landowners when conducting these forest operations. Beginning with goal 1, which we have further quantified in our objectives, is to generate revenue in accordance with shareholder values by maintaining or increasing each woodlot's value and productivity over a long-term sustainable basis. To do this, we are going to assume that the Southern New Brunswick Wood Cooperative Infrastructure and Silviculture Assistance Program continues to exist. We will ensure that 100% of these stand tending treatments and operations are eligible for this reimbursement program. We will also maintain a non-declining area of productive forest across each woodlot, with the exception of new forest roads for forest operations, and will ensure that undesirable species such as red maple, birch, and aspen, and species that facilitate a spruce budworm outbreak such as balsam fir will encompass a minimum of 50% of the volume harvested in the 5-year operations plan. Goal 2 is to conduct operations with regard to environmentally sensitive areas and maintain the composition of the client's desired species within each stand. So to do this, we're going to recommend a no harvest buffer on all streams, wetlands, and stick nests of varying sizes found within each property, and maintain a non-declining composition of red spruce, black spruce, eastern white pine, and red pine within each stand. Finally, goal 3 is to manage and operate each property with consideration of local communities of Syphers, Cove, and Nichols Beach area through the preservation of viewsheds and recreational trails. To do this, we're going to ensure that operations do not damage these trails, or if they do, recommend a monitoring plan, if damage does occur. Objective 2, where each woodlot borders residential and recreational properties, We're only going to recommend operations that do not remove greater than 50% of the basal area, such as selection harvest and pre-commercial thinning.
Thank you. So moving forward, we thought it would be a good idea to share with everybody some of the basic methods we employed to get to where we are today, starting off with how we conducted our timber inventory, how we calculated our volumes, and how we created our long-term forest models. So our inventory was done through 485 systematically spread out plots. We chose a systematic approach for this portion of the product to ensure the entire woodlot was surveyed and no areas were left out. Then we wanted to audit the variance within the data that we collected, so we selected 10% for an intensity for our audit, meaning that we would revisit 10% of our initial plots. We chose a stratified random sample system to do this, so we divided the initial cruise plots up into 5 different sections, assigning 10 audit plots noted in the green trees on this map to each section. This again ensured that the entire woodlot would have a distribution of these audit plots, while also adding an element of randomness to reduce bias. We projected the long-term growth and yields of the forest through a computer program called Stamen, also used by Future Design Forestry. And we also used RemSoft's Woodstock program to help us optimize a long-term 25-year operations plan, which Nick will get into in a little while here. Finally, we used a product ratio calculator created by UNB's own Dr. John Kershaw to convert the standing volumes on the woodlot into products such as softwood pulp, sawlog studwood, and hardwood pulp and sawlogs. When delineating our stands, we gave consideration to prior stand delineations given to us from the Southern New Brunswick Wood Co-op, as well as our client York Baylor. We also used some digital imagery from Geo New Brunswick. However, we found we most heavily relied on LiDAR. And for those of you who aren't sure what LiDAR is, it's basically a light detection technology applied aerially that provides us with a map that looks like this. We can then look at this map and it shows the different canopy heights throughout the woodlot. We can isolate these canopy heights, which we then delineate as our stands. And when we delineated our stands, we looked at the plots that fell within the stands to determine what species were most dominant. So say 9 plots fell within one of the stands you see delineated. We examine the data and we find that red maple and balsam fir are the most dominant species. This stand was then noted as a red maple balsam fir stand. The first assessment result we would like to share with everybody is actually our finalized stand delineations. So if you look on the Baylor property in the middle, you can see it's largely covered in eastern white pine spruce stand types, as he has operated in the woodlot in the past to facilitate the growth of these different species. There are also some small red pine pockets located throughout the woodlot, which are plantations that date back to the 50s and 60s. On the Five Islands property, we can see a much more diverse cover, as it has not been operated in the past as extensively as the Baylor property. So we see again it has a large component of eastern white pine and spruce. It also has a significant component of white pine, red maple spruce, and balsam fir red maple. And moving into the species composition of each woodlot, this is heavily supported by the stand delineation map I just shared. As you can see, the Five Islands property is dominated by 4 main species, which are white pine, red spruce, red maple, and balsam fir. It's also notable that the only eastern white cedar we found on both properties was located within the Five Islands properties. On the York Baylor property, we again see this domination of white pine, as he is selected to leave this species behind through his past operations to allow it to grow and obtain more volume from it in the future. White pine dominance is followed by red spruce, red maple, and balsam fir, as well as those red pine plantations that I mentioned before. We then could calculate the volume distributions of both woodlots. So this is the York Baylor property, again in the center. We see that it falls with, like most of its stands, fall within 100 to 150 meters cube per hectare and 150 to 200 meters cube per hectare, which is fairly typical of an Acadian forest. We do have one outlying area on the eastern portion of the woodlot near Grand Lake, which is actually 300 to 350 meters cube per hectare. It's so much higher because this stand has been operated in the past to allow more growing space to the desired trees, such as red pine and white pine, allowing these trees to grow larger more quickly, producing this higher level of volume. We can see in our stand type table here that the eastern white pine and spruce stands that cover the majority of the woodlot also make up the majority of the volume at 50,000 cubic meters out of 65,000. The Five Islands volume distribution tells much of the same story, with the majority of the woodlot falling between this typical 100 to 200 cubic meter per hectare range. There are some dark green areas in the southern region of the property. These are recent plantations that have not accumulated any significant volume to speak of yet. And again, the dominant species being balsam fir, white pine, spruce, and red maple. Stand types that are variants of these species again make up the majority of the volume on this property. Our operable volumes were then derived from these volumes, and our operable volumes, you'll notice, are lower than the volumes I just shared for each property, as they don't include any stems larger than 60 centimeters in diameter, as these stems can't be processed at mills, nor do they include any wood that falls within the buffers that Anika mentioned earlier. So the average volume per hectare was very similar for both properties at 153 meters cubed per hectare for the Baylor property and 157 meters cubed for the Five Islands property, totaling 55,000 meters cubed in the Baylor property and 92,000 meters cubed in the Five Islands property. The current age class structure of the woodlot shows most of the trees falling between 50 and 60 years old, which is consistent with what we know about the woodlot's past. There are some outliers on either side, but again, 50 to 60 years old is the average tree age. The property was evaluated in 2 steps, with the first being a bare land valuation. We decided on a dollar value per hectare of $320 for the bare land of the property. This is relatively high on the end of the bare land spectrum. However, we felt it justified given that the property has excellent road frontage, is located within cottage country, and has a small area bordering Grand Lake. The standing timber was the next thing that was calculated. So we took our inventory volumes in conjunction with the product ratio calculator I mentioned earlier to determine not only the volume of wood on the property, but the volume of pulp, the volume of studwood and saw logs, as well as the volume of hardwood pulp and saw logs on the property. We could then use net mill prices to assign dollar values to these volumes to give us these totals we see in the table, which show the York Baylor property being valued at $1 million and the Five Islands property being valued at just north of $2.1 million, resulting in a combined total for both landowners of $3.1 million. And just to be clear, this is an absolute best case scenario, as it follows the assumption that every product on the woodlot can be cut, trucked, and sold for full price at the mills, regardless of any potential damage or quality issues with disease, nor does it consider the spatial distribution of certain products scattered throughout the woodlot. So our 5-year operations plan was the next thing on our list to complete, and it's basically a silvicultural treatment schedule that aligns with our goals and objectives. Within it are various stand tending operations, as well as a strategic road planning component. It is important to note that this plan does generate revenue for our client, as well as increasing the desired species composition on the woodlot. So again, it facilitates and selects for the red pine, white pine, and spruces, while selecting against red maples, balsam firs, white birches, and aspens. Our stand operations and the stands we recommended, as well as the operations recommended within them, were done manually, and they were influenced largely by the inventory results, our stated goals and objectives, the reimbursement criteria from the Southern New Brunswick Wood Co-op, as well as our stand mean annual increment forecasts. So to be a little bit more explicit about this, to determine a stand and an operation to recommend, we first examined our inventory data to determine what stands met reimbursement criteria. And to clarify on reimbursement criteria, the Southern New Brunswick Wood Co-op, through the New Brunswick Silvicultural Program, can help offset the cost to a private woodlot landowner of contracting and harvesting timber. In order to receive this funding for certain operations, your woodlot must meet minimum stem densities and species compositions. So once we determined stands that met these, we then looked at their mean annual increments, meaning the growth rates over time. Any stands that were showing declining mean annual increments were further prioritized, as once we enter these stands and remove some volume, it will open up space for the residual trees to grow, increasing the growth over time. Finally, when we determined the stands we want to operate in, we looked at their spatial locations in order to create an efficient 5-year harvesting plan. So one thing we did have to contend with was our areas of concern, as Anika mentioned. There are many watercourses, wetlands, and as well as an osprey nesting site within the property. And these all require different no-harvest buffers as per our recommendations, with 30-meter no-harvest buffers, 60-meter no-harvest buffers, and 100-meter no-harvest buffers. To show how this directly affected our 5-year operations plan, we see the stands we recommended here, followed by their total areas, buffer areas, and operable areas. So looking at the top at JB5, for example, we can see it was initially 45 hectares in size. However, 9 of these hectares were located in buffers, reducing the operable volume to 36 hectares, and unfortunately this does reduce the operable volume as well. This map here shows the spatial and temporal layout of the 5-year operations plan, in that it shows what stands are to be harvested in what year, as well as what roads are to be built in what year. So in summary of our 5-year operations plan, it was largely composed of selection harvests and commercial thinnings, as these align strongly with the goals and objectives created by the client, and they can also qualify for reimbursement. Results in a total of 15,000 meters cubed per hectare, or 15,000 meters cubed harvested, resulting in a total net revenue of $287,000 to the client. We do have a product breakdown of this merchantable volume if anyone would like to see it after the presentation. The final component to explain is the 5-year road construction. As I stated, that we had to be strategic about this, as the wood co-op will only reimburse one road per landowner per year. So we had to ensure that the roads were staggered across years and landowners. The initial cost of this was $9,900 for the 3 roads we recommended. However, when we obtain funding, we can offset this cost to the client by $3,000, resulting in $6,930 for roads.
So after the 5-year plan was developed, the next 20 years were optimized using REMSoft's Woodstock modeling software. The huge plus about this modeling software is it allows us to input our current forest conditions, and then a best possible treatment schedule will be generated based on our objectives and then the constraints on these objectives. So for the purpose of our model, our objective was to maximize the net present value at a discount rate of 2.75%. And this is just equivalent to the amount of interest you would earn on investing the same amount of money in a long-term savings account. So the constraints on this objective was that the area harvested had to be less than or equal to 300 hectares per 5-year period, or 60 hectares per year. And this is just based on current historical harvest rates on the woodlot. The next constraint was that the desired stand type areas had to be greater than or equal to the areas they were in 2017. This relates back to our second goal of maintaining the desired pine and spruce ecosystems. The third constraint was to not harvest in any of the buffer areas. This also relates to our second goal, just in terms of maintaining our environmental integrity. Our final constraint was that the basal area removed had to be less than or equal to 50% in stands neighboring residential properties. This relates to our third goal in maintaining and representing the residents of the local area, and this just helps maintain the social license for operations to continue on the woodlot. So this is a brief summary of our 25-year operations plan. As you can see, the area operated varies between 230 and 300 hectares per period for a total operable area of 1,400 hectares. The main treatments used were shelterwood and clearcut, which is different than the selection and commercial thinnings utilized in the 5-year operations plan. The use of shelterwood caused the total area treated to be the 1,400 hectares, which is more than the actual area of the woodlot. And this is just because the shelterwoods required 2 entries to be completed, so the same area was operated on twice. In total, there was just over 78,000 meters cubed of timber removed, and this generated $1.8 million in revenue. This is the resulting forest condition. As Adam covered, most of the stands right now are in the 50 to 60 age range. Post-operations, about half those stands were regenerated and now fall within the 5 and 10-year age classes. So as you see, there's just a little bit better distribution of ages across the woodlot. So as with any forestry planning, there are a lot of uncertainties. We can't really predict when these things will occur, but we can forecast their impacts on the treatment schedule and the net revenue. So we looked at 3 broad categories in this analysis. The first was financial uncertainties. The next was natural disturbances, in this case, the form of eastern spruce budworm. And the last one was the potential for new markets, in this case, selling carbon to businesses as carbon credits. So financial markets, they're notoriously volatile, and it's really not a matter of if they will change, but when. So we looked at 3 broad scenarios. The first was a reduction in our subsidy amounts that we will receive. So we forecasted a reduce in 33% and 66%. This is realistic, as most of the subsidy funding comes from the provincial government. So in terms of an election or a policy change, these subsidies could very easily be cut. The next thing we looked at was a reduction in mill prices. As society is using less and less paper products and other timber products, it's not unrealistic to suspect that the mills will drop prices in order to stay competitive both locally and on an international market. And then the last scenario we looked at was a total mill closure. In this case, we looked at the Sussex mill shutting down, which would effectively eliminate our source for softwood pulp, that market. And there have been 2 major mill closures in New Brunswick, both in Dalhousie and Miramichi, so it's not unrealistic to expect this might occur. So the biggest impact on our net revenue was the 20% reduction in mill prices. So the reason for that is it affected all of our product categories, from pulp all the way up to our saw logs. The reduction in subsidies only really affected the cost to operate these stands, so it didn't have as big of an impact. And also the mill closure didn't have as large of an impact because as it stands, our softwood pulp has the slimmest profit margin, so totally losing that product didn't have a super negative effect. Our next analysis was of the spruce budworm outbreak. So we used a calculator developed by the Funding Model Research Forest, along with Forest Research, and along with some recommendations from Dr. McLean here at the Forestry faculty. So we predicted the spruce budworm would arrive in the year 2022, and the outbreak would last for 20 years. And we figured the severity would be the same as the last outbreak seen in the 1970s and the 1980s. So the first row on this woodlot shows the potential damage to the woodlot as if it remained unoperated for the next 25 years. So this just shows the damages as the trees will grow through time based on the current predictions for the spruce budworm. So the financial loss as it stands is $2.5 million. The next two rows, they show stands just in the 5-year operational period. This is to contrast the effects of if we continued to let the stands grow naturally through time, and then if we operated on them to remove host species such as balsam fir and spruce to see if any of the damage could be mitigated by strategic operations. In this case, we found that we could reduce the financial loss by about 15% based on removing these host species. So in all the scenarios, there's the option for foliage protection in the form of spraying pesticides for the spruce budworm. The current cost of this would be $40 per hectare. And we found a publication from the Quebec government that said the most economical way to spray for the spruce budworm would be to spray consecutively for 2 cycles or 2 years, and then not to spray for the next 2 years. And based on the spraying regime, the total cost to the landowner would be $540,000 across the entire outbreak. So the potential savings are positive for all the scenarios, so we would recommend this treatment to the landowner at this time. So the last scenario we looked at was the potential to sell carbon to businesses in order to offset their total carbon footprint. New Brunswick has discussed the option of implementing a carbon tax or a system where businesses had a limit to the amount of carbon dioxide they could emit. If they exceeded their limit, then they would have to purchase credits from a carbon sink, such as our woodlot. As trees grow, they do take carbon from the atmosphere and store it, so then the landowners would be able to sell this carbon to those businesses to offset their carbon. So the first step to calculating a value was to see how much carbon the trees would sequester as they grew through time. So we based this on the mean annual increment, which is just a measure of tree growth through time. So we converted that to the amount of carbon it would store, and based in the next 5 years, we found that it would earn about $26,000 for the landowner. So in addition to the amount of carbon that would store as the trees grow, there's also a significant source of carbon stored on the woodlot. We figured it would be reasonable to sell 1/3 of this carbon at this time. We chose 1/3 because we still want operations to occur on the woodlot, and in the event of a natural disturbance such as fire, spruce budworm, or wind throw, that really reduced a lot of the inventory. If the landowner ended up selling more carbon than he had stored on the woodlot, he would have to pay those credits back to the businesses, so that's not a very desirable situation. So we, based on an evaluation of $10 per carbon stock, and 1 carbon stock is equal to 1 ton of stored carbon, we figured that the landowners could receive about $880,000 for both woodlots across within the next 5 years based on the stored carbon.
Moving on to a different set of results, we decided that we wanted to break out our project into 2 phases to estimate our hours and costs that have went into this project so far this year. So our phase 1 was from September of last year until just about Christmas time of last year, and this included developing our inventory and implementing this inventory on the woodlots. So we have an estimated hours of about 975 hours doing inventory, our kilometers driven from UMB to the Grand Lake area every day, our various equipment used such as our data collection instruments during inventory, and other little mishaps along the way, totaling just under $30,000 for phase 1 of the project. Phase 2 was after Christmas break of this year until now. This really included developing and finalizing our management plan for both properties and developing our woodstock model for both properties. So our office hours are broken up as UMB's credit hour system, similar. So UMB states that for every 1 credit hour, a student is expected to spend about 3 hours a week on this credit hour. So our 40-20 class is broken up to 8 credit hours, 4 for first semester and 4 for second. So based on 4 credit hours at 11 people at $25 an hour, we have an estimated $39,000 cost for our office hours developing this plan. And various other office hours, or office supplies, which would include our software, so the Woodstock modeling license, as well as ArcGIS and printing and your typical office supplies, totaling an estimated at $42,000 for phase 2 of this project. Bringing our total estimated project cost to $71,712. Just to be clear with this price, this is just, as groups previously stated, this is just an estimated cost of our work that have gone into this project and not necessarily the cost that a landowner would expect from a professional company. Jumping back to our goals and objectives, we're going to walk through our status achieved after our implementation of our operations plans. So beginning with goal 1 was to generate revenue in accordance with shareholder values over a long-term sustainable basis. We have met this goal as we did ensure 100% of our stand heading activities were reimbursed by the SMB reimbursement program. We did maintain a non-declining area of productive forest within each woodlot, but however, for objective 3, we did not meet, as our lower value species did not make up at least 50% of the volumes harvested within the 5-year operations plan. It was estimated they made up about 40%, but this isn't necessarily a negative thing. It just means that both properties have a lot of higher value species that were more feasible to harvest rather than those lower value species. Goal 2 was to conduct operations with regard to environmentally sensitive areas and maintain the desired species composition. We have met this goal, as we did recommend no harvest buffers of various sizes on all streams, wetlands, and stick nests found within each property. This goes above and beyond industry standard for private woodlots. And we did maintain a non-declining composition of the spruce and pine types within each stand. Finally, goal 3 is to manage and operate the woodlot with consideration of the local communities through the preservation of viewsheds and recreational trails. We have achieved this goal. It is still ongoing, although for objective 1 that we can't say for sure that our operations don't damage the previous in place recreational trails, but we do have a monitoring plan in place if these damages do occur. We have met objective 2, which was where stands border these recreational properties and residential properties, only operations that did not remove greater than 50% of the basal area were performed, such as selection harvest and commercial thinning. Concluding, we'd like to thank all of the individuals here for, if it wasn't for them, a project of this size would not have been possible, especially to Jorg and Gloria Baylor and the stakeholders of Five Islands Forest Development for allowing us and trusting us to conduct this management plan on their property, and to Jason and Sean for overseeing every aspect of this property and answering all of our questions. With that, I would like to invite my fellow colleagues of future forest planners to come down and join me, and we will open it up to question period.